The man I'm about to speak to knows exactly what he's talking about, and this is so important. This is a matter of life and death. Now, as we know, if you've been watching the news, UNRWA, that is the United Nations agency which looks after Palestinian refugees, the main humanitarian agency in Gaza, is under attack. This comes after the ruling by the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the highest court on earth, which put Israel on trial for alleged genocide. Suddenly, Israel turned the tables and put the United Nations in the dock. They accused members of UNRWA of being linked to the 7th of October attack. They said essentially 0.04% of its employees were linked without providing the evidence, and that was enough for Western governments to pull the plug. That in a context where 80% of the hungriest people on earth are in Gaza, the healthcare system's been trashed. This spells catastrophe. Now, I wanted to find out the reality. So Chris Gunness is the guy who knows this. He was the chief spokesperson for UNRWA until 2020 for 14 years. He knows that organisation inside out. And I want to speak to him about the claims and the reality about what this all means. And I started by asking him, what does UNRWA actually do? Who are the people who make it up? What are its functions and its responsibilities?
I think it's easiest for a general audience to think of UNRWA as being like a government. It works in Syria, Jordan, the West Bank, Gaza, and Lebanon. It has 706 schools. It has 550,000 students, 7 million patient visits per year in its primary health clinics. 400,000 people, the most vulnerable in the Middle East, use its relief and social services department. It has emergency food for 1.7 million people. 1.2 million of those are in Gaza. So it's like a government delivering government services. That's its core. But it also has emergency programs, which, let's look at Gaza today. What we've got is basically emergency services for pretty much all 2.3 million people in Gaza. So it has its core programs, education, health, relief, and social services. And then in times of terrible crisis like we're now seeing, it has to not quite drop everything, it has to keep that ticking over, but rush into action and get these emergency services going. And that's why this massive defund, which I'm very clear is the result of a political plot, if you like, to defund UNRWA, that's why that's so critical, because those emergency services for the people, coming in to the food distribution centers in Gaza, the mothers with their babies, all of that, that's what's threatened now. And that's going to run out in a matter of weeks. And that's why this donor defund is so absolutely terrible. They've gone and they've taken nearly half a billion dollars with them, $500,000.
I mean, we'll come on to the potential consequences and how devastating this could be. Just in terms of what we're talking about here, this plot, as you put it. So, to be clear, what happened was accusations were made by the Israeli state that of the 30,000 employees, essentially 0.04% were involved on October 7th. There weren't specifics to begin with, but the accusations then went on that, for example, potential involvement in kidnapping. I mean, obviously, we're talking about a tiny proportion of the overall staff, but even then, the accusations may have been extracted by Shin Bet, the military intelligence agency, which has questions to answer often about torture and the way confessions are extracted. But nonetheless, what's your sense of what these documents actually say? And bear in mind, Sky News said the Israeli intelligence documents make several claims that Sky News has not seen proof of, and many of the claims, even if true, do not directly implicate UNRWA.
To be clear, what happened is that the Commissioner General of UNRWA, the sort of chief executive, was called to a meeting in Tel Aviv, which I understand from sources within UNRWA, he was given information. I don't think you can even call it evidence, which included a list of names. It was 12, apparently it's now 13. There was also a dossier which UNRWA has confirmed to me very recently. They were not even handed over that dossier. And it was leaked to the New York Times first, before UNRWA even saw it. UNRWA was never given this dossier. And now we have news that Antony Blinken is apparently saying that he cannot independently confirm the information that they've been given. So, and yet he says it's very, very credible. I mean, go and figure that. The US Secretary of State has taken this decision to lead this massive defund of a huge humanitarian organization dealing with the consequences of an alleged genocide which the American army is giving support to, political, and of course because of the situation in the Security Council where America has been vetoing any attempts to get a ceasefire. But apparently America is blocking aid to an organization without even knowing whether that information that it's basing this decision on is correct. And I assume that that is true of the British Foreign Office, Andrew Mitchell and his department. I mean, did Andrew Mitchell see the evidence? Did he make this decision which is going to, potentially cause further starvation in Gaza? People giving giving birth to babies in the most appalling circumstances, operations without anesthetics. I mean, these, are the consequences of the decision. And I think there are some serious questions to ask. On what basis did these donors make this decision? Did they see this dossier? Because I can tell you, it was never handed over to UNRWA, and it would appear from what UNRWA are telling me that they have never been given the chance. They've never been given confirmed information. What has UNRWA done? As part of its zero tolerance policy towards these neutrality violations, it has dismissed all 13 people, 3 of whom we understand are either dead or missing. But to be clear, these are 13 bad apples in a staff UNRWA-wide of 33 odd thousand and in UNRWA 13,000. It's a double betrayal, if I can say. It's a betrayal of UNRWA and the refugees it serves, UNRWA staff, who, by the way, they feel betrayed as well by these people. They are absolutely furious that a handful of rotten apples have done this, which they are frankly appalled by, and they are now picking up the consequence of this. But it's also the second layer of betrayal is by the donors. The donors have left UNRWA in the lurch. These are people who UNRWA work with to bring about frameworks of neutrality. We were audited in 2019 by the General Auditor's Office of the United States. There was a root and branch audit turning over all this neutrality, all this stuff. And guess what? America carried on funding UNRWA to the tune of 350 million. And yet now they're suddenly being told that, there needs to be reform. We need to start looking into management processes. All of the donors have had this information. They're constantly in this discussion with UNRWA. UNRWA is perhaps the most audited UN agency in the history of the UN, and it's spent more time satisfying donor demands for this. So it's rather odd that the donors are today saying, we need to see further neutrality work, further reforms. And that's why I say it looks like a political conspiracy, because 2 important points. At no stage did any of the donors say to UNRWA, we're doing this because we want the following effect. UNRWA saying, why are you doing this? No answer. These donors who stood by us through thick and thin have suddenly abandoned UNRWA and said, no, we're doing this and we're not telling you why, apparently. And the second is, UNRWA's never been told what they've got to do to have the aid restored. I mean, if you say I'm taking away all your money, but if you do this and do that, sack these people, we'll restore the aid, that would be fine. Well, there would be questions, but by and large, it would be fine. They've not even done that, which is why it feels like a political conspiracy driven by the Israelis based on an intelligence dossier, which is far confirmed, as we hear from none other than the US Secretary of State.
I have to say, it's just worth just drilling down on that a bit more, because I've got the direct quote here from the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who says, "We haven't had the ability to investigate ourselves," by which he means the allegations presented by Israel, "but they are highly, highly credible." I don't know how you can call anything highly, highly credible if you haven't investigated yourself. But I mean, this is actually worse than a lot of people suggest, because some have said, well, this would be like defunding the National Health Service because of, for example, Harold Shipman or Lucy Letby. I mean,
Yeah.
But actually that's different because they were convicted of crimes for a start. I mean, in a normal organization, if there are accusations against employees, there is a process on which you have applied the rules of natural justice, which include innocent until proven guilty for a start. You have a proper investigation. You don't say, well, members of an organization, 0.04%, have been accused of some unspecified crimes. We haven't had an investigation yet. We haven't seen the evidence, but we're going to kick them out entirely, and donors are going to, and the funding is going to be cut off. I mean, that's absolutely extraordinary, and I can't think of any precedent for that.
I mean, in the world of development, which I've been in, it's called poor donorship. I mean, yes, it's extraordinary, and the whole world should be saying, wait a minute, isn't that bizarre that all of these governments have defunded UNRWA. UNRWA's not been given a chance to answer the evidence. Let's call it evidence. They may have been handed over some names and some information, but it's not had a chance. And these people have been dismissed virtually before the inquiry in New York. So the Office of Internal Oversight, this is the big investigative body up in New York, they've barely begun. I mean, we're going for a few days now, but barely had they started, and these people were dismissed because the Commissioner General of UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini, who's an excellent humanitarian, and who there have been these crazy calls for his dismissal from Israel, which is, if Israel wants a really solid partner for doing solid humanitarian work based on the UN principles of neutrality, look no further than Philippe Lazzarini. But here we have a situation where UNRWA is being accused of these things. I mean, to use the Lucy Letby analogy, it's the equivalent of the government defunding the NHS when there are unconfirmed reports that Lucy Letby might be a child killer. I mean, that's a nearer analogy to what's going on. So, it's very, very troubling. Israel has long had this agenda. Israel believes that if it can get rid of UNRWA, it will somehow get rid of the refugees we serve. And that's important because they, in this slightly, far-right fantasy world, they believe that if you get rid of UNRWA, you get rid of the right of return. Their fear is that they want to go back to Israel proper, and that will dilute the Jewish nature of the state. Of course, it's far from clear what the refugees want because no one's ever asked them. But I mean, my point is that there is this idea that if you get rid of UNRWA, you get rid of the refugees. That's a bit like saying if you get rid of Oxfam, you get rid of poor people. I mean, poor people would still have rights. They would have the right to human development of all sorts. And, some far-right Israeli cabinet can't simply airbrush these rights out of the agenda. So, let's be clear, Britain and the other donors, so it would appear, are being driven by a far-right Israeli agenda attacking UNRWA. And, it's far from clear when these funds are going to be resumed. And this is all because of something which has been dreamt up by Israelis, which is in and of itself not true. These 6 million people who are the registered refugees, they're all human beings with an individual dignity and a destiny which must be respected. And it is very clear that they have inalienable rights, including individual and group rights. And those include the full panoply of rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, including the right to self-determination. So when Israel says, it's UNRWA that perpetuates the refugee crisis, that's not true. What perpetuates the refugee crisis is the failure of the parties, Israel included, and we've seen the obstructionism we've seen from Mr. Netanyahu against a two-state solution. It's the failure of the international community, specifically the parties to the conflict, to find what they call a just and durable solution for the refugees. That is what perpetuates the problem. And it's also said by Israel that UNRWA is unique in giving refugee status to the children of refugees. That's not true. UNHCR, the other UN agency that deals with the other refugees, that was created before UNRWA was created. The 1951 Refugee Convention came after the creation of UNRWA in 1949. It became operational on the ground in May 1950. But my point is that the other refugee agency also registers the children of refugees. So if if Israel thinks that by just giving the refugees over to UNHCR, it magically gets rid of the right of return, it doesn't. These rights are inalienable. And the history of UNRWA's relationship with the UN, the Palestinians' relationship with the UN, goes right back to the founding of the state of Israel. It's a very long history. There are a lot of resolutions, and Israel cannot just airbrush those out. If Israel wants to change UNRWA's mandate, it needs to go to the General Assembly, where there are nearly 200 members, needs to make some friends, needs to say, we want to get rid of UNRWA, we want you to buy into a resolution, we want you to vote for it, and then they can get rid of UNRWA. Until that happens, they can't do it. They can try and defund UNRWA, and I'd like to talk a bit about that financial crisis and how UNRWA might fill that. But politically, a far-right Israel cabinet cannot wave a wand and get rid of an agency which has a long and established relationship with the Palestinian people and the refugees they serve.
And just so everyone's clear about the history, I hope everyone's become far more educated over the last few months, but obviously you had the Nakba, the catastrophe, in 1948, when 750,000 Palestinians were driven from their homes, 15,000 killed, and then in Or fled.
Driven or fled.
Yeah, sorry, but 15,000 killed, but you're right, 750,000 fled or expelled. In 1967 as well, potentially 200, maybe 1,000 extra. And then you have their descendants, and then many Gaza, people often don't know, the vast majority of people living in Gaza are either the descendants of those refugees or the refugees, if they're still alive themselves. But I mean, this point you make here, because Benjamin Netanyahu said yesterday in a speech about UNRWA, where he linked it very emotively to 7th of October. But then he said, I think the key line, it seeks to preserve the issue of Palestinian refugees. We must replace UNRWA with other UN agencies and other aid agencies. I mean, isn't that the point? Do you think this is slightly something of a coincidence that the UN's top court, the world's highest court, but the UN's top court places Israel in the dock for alleged genocide, and then immediately Israel places the United Nations in the dock? And what they've done in the process is taken a long-standing issue. They want to shut down UNRWA because it keeps alive the sense of Palestinians being refugees who might have the idea of a right to return hangs over all of that. And Western states are just in cahoots now with that.
I mean, to be frank, it's cynical news manipulation. Every time there's a spike in fighting, violence, wars in Gaza, these accusations come out. Believe me, I've been there. I've got the T-shirt. I mean, I can't tell you how much disinformation came out in 2014 when I was the UNRWA spokesman. Every time they hit an UNRWA school and killed a load of people, Israeli spokespeople, civilian and military, would phone up journalists and say, oh, there were militants inside the schools. And they would phone me up and say, you know, they're saying there are militants inside the schools. Of course, in the fog of war, it's very hard for an unarmed humanitarian organization to march into a war zone and confirm there are no militants. But when we interviewed really reliable, long-standing, responsible UNRWA staff about these incidents later, the vast majority of it was shown to be utter nonsense. Now, I'm not saying these accusations now about these workers are utter nonsense, but we have discussed at length, Owen, the fact that this information has not been independently confirmed by the donors. And I think that's something really important to hold on to.
Yeah, and the point you're making is it doesn't. Firstly, you're right that it could or could not be true. It's just not being investigated independently and verified. And secondly, it doesn't mean a tiny number of employees. That means it's representative.
Yeah, but by the way, I hope you get someone like Andrew Mitchell on to your podcast and say to him, Mr. Mitchell, with due respect, you've made a decision which is deploying up to 6 million of the most desperate people in the Middle East of human development services. On what basis did you make that decision? Did the British intelligence services corroborate this information? Did you hand it over to UNRWA? And if not, why not? And are you satisfied that this whole drama was actually based on reality? And by the way, if the answer to all those questions are, well, not sure, then you might follow up with the question of, well, has Britain been hoodwinked by Israeli news management? Because that would be a really shocking conclusion to come to. But Owen, can I just address one thing? You mentioned in your last question, this thing about Netanyahu talking about UNRWA being replaced. I mean, we dealt with this thing about UNRWA perpetuating the conflict. I mean, the idea that a state whose army is lobbing thousands of missiles and 2,000 pounds bombs into one of the most densely populated parts of the world is an organization of perpetuating the conflict, the war. I mean, that takes a fair amount to, that's the stuff of political satire. If it weren't so utterly tragic, it might be funny. But on this other question of replacing UNRWA has 15,000 staff, all doing essential work. If you wanted to replace UNRWA, you'd have to recruit 15,000 staff. That means putting job adverts in newspapers or on websites. There's now 46+% unemployment in Gaza, and since the war, pretty much total unemployment. So you can imagine you'll get 1.5 million, let's say, applications. The personnel, the HR department in UNRWA would have to sort through these application forms. They'd have to do the first round of interviews, sift through them, do the second round of interviews, employ, bring on board the 13,000 new members of staff. They'd have to do neutrality, security screening. They'd have to do all the neutrality training, which, by the way, has been inculcated into the corporate culture of UNRWA. That's why they're so good at neutrality. And that's one of the, that's the family silver of UNRWA. It's the neutrality training. No organization like UNRWA could work inside the place it works in these terrible situations in Syria, in Lebanon, etc., and in Gaza and the West Bank if it wasn't utterly neutral and worked very very hard. You then have to bring all these people on board. And by the way, UNRWA staff members are paid way below even the local members of other UN agencies. And there aren't enough of those in Gaza. There are maybe a few hundred. So the price for the donors, be careful what you wish for in deciding to get rid of UNRWA, it would become much more expensive. Oh, and by the way, one other thing, I would suggest that some of the best doctors, the best nurses, the best engineers, the best logisticians, the best technicians, they're already working for UNRWA. So if you get rid of UNRWA, by definition, you're probably going to get second best people working. This is dreamt up by armchair humanitarians for political purposes in London, in Whitehall, in DC, in Paris, in the Quai d'Orsay, wherever. They have no conception of what it takes to run a huge humanitarian operation like this in Gaza. And if they did, they wouldn't say so glibly, oh, by the way, let's just get rid of UNRWA and get someone else to do it. And one of the most interesting responses for all this has been some of the Israeli generals, because they realize that, well, first of all, under the Fourth Geneva Convention, which is about the treatment of civilians in times of conflict, the occupying power, brackets Israel, is obliged to provide water, to provide fuel, to provide food, to provide education, to provide health. So the Israeli generals are going, uh-oh, if you get rid of UNRWA, we might have to do it, panic. And I think that is also occurring to the donors, that, okay, forget about the IDF. UNRWA is the best choice they have, and it's a very good choice. It's done 70 plus years of neutrality work with its staff. They are proud of what they do. As far as they're concerned, it's their finest hour, and they feel betrayed. They feel stabbed in the back by these donors who, through the decades, like the British department, was DFID, it's now whatever it is, they've been warmly embraced. We love, we are supporting you, we care about you. And in a heartbeat, based on what looks like a pretty dodgy dossier, they've been abandoned. So, let's take a deep breath. Let's realize you can't abolish UNRWA. And by the way, if you abolish UNRWA, what about Lebanon? What about Syria? What about Jordan? Who's going to look after the refugees there? And by the way, the British government, as well as, the American government, they all are desperately keen to avoid the spreading of a regional conflagration around the Middle East. They're saying we want to contain this. That was the sort of leitmotif, the main leitmotif of Tony Blinken's, the American Secretary of State's whistle-stop trip of the Middle East. And yet, they're depriving human development from up to 6 million of the most marginalized and desperate people living in these terrible refugee camps around the Middle East, in Syria, in Lebanon. Now, this is at a time when the Houthis are holding up Gaza as one of the reasons for their attacks on Western shipping interests, at a time when northern Israel and the border with Lebanon is becoming hotter and hotter, at a time when Iran has just lobbed a load of missiles into Pakistan. 3 American servicemen were killed on the Jordanian-Syrian border just a few days ago. There are attacks in Syria, in Iraq. So the British government and others are desperately keen to avoid an escalation of this, and yet they've just removed funding from one of the agencies that does education for over 500,000 children, giving them a sense of normality, bringing them into the fold of civilized nations. Palestinian kids, if you talk to them, they see themselves as citizens of the world. Go and talk to our school parliaments. They are inspirational. They have an awful lot to teach these Western politicians who've just put their education on hold. So, let me be clear, this will not add to regional stability. It will destabilize a tinderbox region already in the state of meltdown. And that's another reason why this decision is utterly insane and it needs to be reversed immediately.
Just in terms of another plank of the assault on UNRWA, which is a dossier alleging basically widespread links between UNRWA and Hamas, with even and I say this not in a positive way, the extraordinary Israeli government spokesperson Elon Levy suggesting UNRWA is a front for Hamas. Now, confusingly, a near namesake of Michael, Mark Owen Jones, who's a very good, brilliant academic who investigates misinformation, and he went through this dossier and he found that actually adjusting for demographics, it shows alleged Hamas presence in UNRWA is lower than elsewhere in Gaza. Most UNRWA employees are women, for example. It goes through the kind of claims made against it. But I'm also aware of the work of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International from previous conflicts, where they say Israel has a habit of using Hamas in a catch-all way to blur the distinction between military and civilian, when what people hear Hamas, they think terrorist, but actually it's used to absorb various different institutions which are not actually terrorist elements, for example.
Yeah, I mean, can I address that by standing back for one moment and looking at Israel's description of Hamas? We were told by Mr. Netanyahu and by others that there couldn't be a ceasefire because Israel needed to destroy Hamas. Now, Hamas is a political movement, and they're strong in other parts. They're very strong in the West Bank, in the camps in Lebanon, in Syria, elsewhere. So if Israel thinks that by blowing up a bunch of civilian department blocks and flooding the tunnels, it's somehow going to be able to eradicate a political movement, which, by the way, in elections in the West Bank on January the 30th, 2006, won an overwhelming victory in elections described by the Carter Center as the freest and fairest ever held in the Middle East, which I assume includes Israeli elections. So, the idea that you can somehow blow up with these massive bombs a political movement, that is absurd. And of course, we've had Yitzhak Herzog, the Israeli president, saying that there's no distinction between the Hamas fighters and the rest of the population, which of course, that's part of the genocidal case against them, that they're dehumanizing by making these sorts of statements. But it's also unempirical. How do you prove that? If I said that, the New York Times covered this story, if I say, well, 10% of the New York Times are members of the Ku Klux Klan, how do you prove that? I mean, it's impossible. It's an absurd allegation because it can't be confirmed or denied. So, let's see this for what it is. UNRWA has got the best neutrality frameworks out of all of the UN agencies working on the planet because they've been doing this neutrality work to the satisfaction of their donors for a very, very long time. And I think that's the way to approach this question.
Because that really important point about neutrality embedded in, because what they're trying to do, the likes, Israeli spokespeople, the Israeli state, is to basically give Western public opinion the idea that UNRWA has basically been infiltrated and overrun by Hamas, that it is essentially
Yes.
there's no distinction between,
without any evidence. I mean, here we have more exaggerated, hyperbolic, unempirical, unsubstantiated claims against UNRWA, and UNRWA's being forced to take these decisions, staff disciplinary decisions, on the basis of these hyperbolic assertions. It's completely unfair. And by the way, I mean, one other point to make. Impact SE, which was one of the groups that has been making allegations about UNRWA's curriculum. So one of the other accusations
yes, I was going to ask
UNRWA, is that its curriculum is anti-Semitic and it preaches violence. To be clear, UNRWA, in all the areas where it works, Syria, Jordan, West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, it uses the textbooks of the host authorities. And the reason for that is because they're preparing children for public examinations in these places. So if you want to get kids through their exams in Jordan, you've got to teach them the Jordanian curriculum, Syria, Lebanon, etc. In Gaza and West Bank, we use the PA curriculum, the Palestinian Authority Education Department curriculum. Now, UNRWA vets every single book that that goes into their classrooms. Where problematic material is found, and that's generally between 3 and 4%, it's vetted on 3 criteria. 1, political neutrality. 2, age-appropriate violence. And 3, gender balance. So women have got to be portrayed in a way which is in keeping with UN values. And as I say, between 3, maximum 4% of this, where there are these problematic areas, UNRWA produces what they call enrichment material, but it's alternative. So we say to our teachers, look, on page 50 of the history book for grades 3, there's this rather problematic passage about Zionism or the occupation or whatever it might be. Use these other versions. There's teacher training, very much teacher-centered training, which goes on, has done for years, by the way. There's a framework for teaching, this stuff, bring it into the classrooms. It's regularly inspected and audited. Teachers are given. That's about as good as it gets. And by the way, the Palestinians turn around and say, well, according to UNESCO, Palestinian children have a right to learn about their history and culture. And, under pressure from the Americans, the Israelis, you're writing this out. Now, one of the groups that testified in Congress the other day, and which has made these allegations against UNRWA, Impact SE, in 2019, they went public and made this huge allegation that UNRWA's enrichment materials were biased and taught anti-Semitism and hatred. When we started to examine it, it turned out they got the wrong curriculum materials. They weren't UNRWA. So they went to the donors, this is Impact SC, went to the donors with all of this stuff, and they weren't even talking about UNRWA books. This happened, quite a bit earlier when they actually had a different name, when they started examining Jordanian and Egyptian books and started going crazy at UNRWA, and they didn't realize that these were Jordanian Egyptian and not the PA books that we use in our schools. So this organization has a proven track record of making some pretty massive howlers. And yet there they were in Congress the other day, being cross-examined by all of these Congress people, being treated as if they were great authorities. They are not taken seriously by proper educationalists. And there they are, stirring up more misinformation. Another example of their agenda. When Palestine was trying to join UNESCO, the UN's Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, they lobbied very hard against Palestine being members. Now, if Palestine to join, Palestinian membership gives them, a support in curriculum reform, doing all of the kind of stuff which we all want them to do. And there was Impact SE trying to block Palestinians have access to it, block membership. There was a clear political agenda. This is the organization being held up in Congress as a great authority and being politically unbiased. Actually, their methodology is highly questionable. The factual empirical basis upon which these allegations are made is highly, highly questionable. I was actually on LBC the other day, and to my horror and amazement, the person who runs this organization was the interviewee before me, and I was too embarrassed. I didn't want to embarrass my host on the program, but basically they were giving airtime to somebody who, frankly, in the world of education is not well respected.
By the way, I think a lot of people listening to this or watching this will find a lot of this extraordinary because they will have heard a lot of these claims and they haven't been debunked in media outlets which have a responsibility to tell the truth.
And Owen, that's because the asymmetry in the conflict on the battlefield is also true of the asymmetry of the information war. Let's be clear about this. And as we've been discussing, in war, cliche of cliches, the truth is the first casualty. Well, the dodgy dossier we've discussed, UNRWA's education allegations, again, really, you've got to look at what UNRWA actually does, the extraordinary neutrality work that UNRWA's education department, these are proper education professionals who've really got a track record in doing this stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's astonishing that this is being, but the asymmetry that I was talking about, UNRWA's got, a few public information professionals, and I pay tribute to the likes of Juliet Toomer, Tamara Rifai, who are working, 24/7 to try and battle all of this disinformation. But really, you've got this huge information machinery which Israel has just presses the button, the ambassador in London and ex-ones from the UN and all of the prime ministers, the foreign office, the president's office. And by the way, I mean, interestingly, after the 7th of October, what you got is 3 basic lies. You've got this is an unexpected attack. There was no context. Well, actually, there was since 48, the dispossession, since 67, the occupation and the apartheid system that's forced on the Palestinians, and since 2007, the occupation of Gaza. That's the context. We were told that this was, Hamas have got to be, there can't be a ceasefire. They've got to destroy Hamas. Well, that's impossible. We all know that it's impossible to destroy Hamas. And so, it was based on a series of lies which the world believed. It bought the Israeli narrative, hook, line, and sinker. That's exactly what's happened again. I know, and before I finish, and I will have to go in a second if you don't mind.
Yeah, I know, because I was going to just very finally ask, because I know you've got a rush. So yeah, because misinformation.
Can I say one quick thing about the donor base? So this regrettable thing happened with the chokehold with this plot by the Western donors. It all happened because the large majority of UNRWA's biggest donors are Western. So when they defunded, they took $500 million, they took 500 million with them, which is about a third of UNRWA's budget. If the Arab world were prepared to be generous, and they are, and to recognize that there is a 21st century alleged genocide, a plausible genocide, to use the phraseology of the ICJ, taking place against their Arab brothers and sisters, and they were prepared to come forward and be generous, UNRWA's reliance on Western aid would go away. I mean, one quick fact, in 2022, which is the last statistic I could find, OPEC's oil revenue was $888 billion. Now, that is 0.02% of UNRWA's budget, 1.5 billion, is 0.02% of OPEC's profits. So with about a nanosecond of oil revenues, UNRWA's financial problems could be solved by Arab donors really in a heartbeat. And I like to think that one of the lessons that has to be learned moving away from this, and I think we are going to move away from it, I hope very quickly, is that UNRWA must bring in, that Arab donors must come forward and must rid UNRWA of what we've seen is this difficult alliance, shall we say, this difficult reliance on Western donors. We need to bring in the Arab donors. So this stranglehold, this plot, as I say, based on goodness knows what, can never happen again. So I do hope that the Arab donors will come forward, recognize that it's not their back garden, it's their front garden. It's not their backyard, it's happening, in front of their very eyes. Huge instability, which could really have massive economic and social implications, security, stability implications for the whole Arab world. So I hope one of the things that might come out of this moving forward is that Arab donors could be encouraged to come forward.
Chris, really appreciate it. I know you're so busy at the moment and your voice is so critical right now. So for those watching this, make sure we share this video as far and wide. I'll also clip various bits.
I know, and one very last point. On this thing about UNRWA perpetuating the refugee problem, what will end the refugee problem and UNRWA's, the need for UNRWA services is that the plight of the refugees should be resolved in the context of a just and durable solution, which gives them justice, accountability, dignity, development, prosperity. That is what is needed for these refugees in the context of a just and durable solution. Then UNRWA can be defunded, it can go away, it can pass on its services to the new Palestinian state. That's what we all want in UNRWA.
Amen. And that is the only lasting solution. A just peace where the land can be shared fairly and justly by both Israeli Jews and Palestinians. Chris, thank you so much. Your voice is so desperately needed now. As I say, please share, please like and subscribe. But Chris, thank you so much.
Pleasure. Goodbye to you. It's a real pleasure to be on your podcast, real honor. And to all your audience, I hope you take these words, as the Palestinians would say, from my mouth to the ears of God. Let's hope that happens.
A beautiful phrase. Cheers, Chris.